On December 14, 2025, Hollywood fell into stunned silence. Rob Reiner, the legendary director and his wife of more than 3 decades, Michelle Singer Reiner, were taken from this world in a brutal homicide that left the entire globe reeling. 2 lives were stolen in silence inside their private home in Brentwood, Los Angeles. The bodies were discovered by family members themselves on that fateful afternoon. The tragedy laid bare the cold, merciless hand of fate, showing that even those who had devoted their entire lives to telling warm, life-affirming stories to the world were not spared from its cruelty. The films that once brought laughter, love, and kindness now suddenly feel like a heavy farewell. Rob Reiner left behind not only a towering cinematic legacy, but also the image of a man who throughout his life believed unwaveringly in justice, in family, and in human values that he never compromised. Few people knew that before his death, Rob Reiner had endured years of quiet suffering because of his son's struggle with addiction. A smoldering family tragedy that he carried almost to the very end of his life. And most bitter of all at this moment, that very son is now being placed under suspicion by investigators in direct connection with the deaths of Rob Reiner and his wife. A chilling detail that has sent shivers through public opinion. And before we go any deeper into this heartbreaking story, please leave a heart as a gesture of condolences and tribute to an artist who devoted his entire life to cinema and who now leaves behind only a silent void. On Sunday afternoon, December 14th at approximately 3:30 p.m., the Los Angeles Fire Department received a call requesting medical assistance at a residence in the Brentwood neighborhood of West Los Angeles. When authorities arrived at the scene, they discovered that Rob Reiner, 78, and his wife, Michelle Singer Reiner, were deceased. That afternoon had passed quietly, like so many others. Sunlight still filtered through the tree-lined streets, and the neighborhood retained its familiar calm, the kind of stillness typical of a place accustomed to privacy. There were no unusual sounds, nothing that drew attention, no sign that anything was amiss, until the silence inside the house lasted longer than it normally should have. The Los Angeles Police Department later responded to the scene. Rob Reiner and Michelle were found inside the very home they had long regarded as a refuge from the glare of Hollywood. There were no signs of forced entry. The windows were intact. There was no evidence suggesting the hurried arrival or departure of an intruder. It was simply an enclosed space where both had sustained stab wounds, injuries serious enough that investigators could not look outward for answers, but were compelled instead to turn their focus inward toward the family itself. The case was soon transferred to the LAPD's Robbery-Homicide Division. In official records, it was classified as an apparent homicide, a death bearing clear indications of criminal activity, though without a final determination. At a press conference that evening, police offered no new details. They reiterated only that the investigation was ongoing. No suspect had been taken into custody. No official theory had been announced. That restraint did nothing to ease the atmosphere. On the contrary, it allowed the sense of heaviness to spread even further. The Reiner family, for their part, chose to say as little as possible. With profound sadness, we announced the tragic passing of Michelle and Rob Reiner. A brief statement read, "We respectfully ask for privacy during this difficult time. No details, no explanations. Just a request for silence, something Rob Reiner, a man who spent his life making films and engaging in public debate, rarely granted himself." At 78, Rob Reiner was no longer someone who needed to prove his place in Hollywood. The films he made had long transcended award lists to become part of a shared cultural memory. Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, A Few Good Men. People remember them not for their scale or technical bravura, but for the familiar feeling they evoke, as if those stories had once unfolded somewhere within their own lives. Perhaps for that reason, news of his death spread in a heavy, subdued atmosphere, not loud or sensational, but weighty enough to cause many to fall silent in the very same moment. Just one day after the tragedy, tributes began to appear. Barack Obama remembered Rob Reiner as a storyteller who helped America look back at itself not through slogans, but through deeply human stories. He wrote, "Rob Reiner understood America in a way that only those who truly love it can tell." Gavin Newsom called Reiner a forthright and consistent voice, one who was always willing to accept controversy. Nancy Pelosi spoke of him as an artist who never separated cinema from civic responsibility. Within the filmmaking community, the grief arrived more quietly. Aaron Sorkin recalled his time working with Reiner on A Few Good Men. "Rob taught me that drama isn't in the smartest line of dialogue, but in the moment when someone stops just before speaking." Billy Crystal wrote simply, "He never pushed you as an actor. He made you want to be better, just by standing there and believing in you." Meg Ryan shared, "Working with Rob felt safe, something rare on a film set. When people speak about Rob Reiner, they do not talk about box office numbers or awards. They remember him through small details, the way he stood behind the camera, lowered his voice to tell an actor to deliver a line as if they were speaking the truth, then stepped back just enough to let the story speak for itself." Throughout his career, Rob Reiner told stories about family, about the bonds between imperfect people, about how individuals stay together even when cracks are always present. The final chapter of his life closed without offering an explanation, and perhaps none is required. Until the investigation concludes, the truth remains behind the closed doors of the Brentwood house. But one thing is already clear: Rob Reiner did not leave as a symbol, but as a human being. And it is precisely that which makes the silence after his death heavier than any farewell. And the death of Rob Reiner does not close the story. It leaves behind a void, and within that void, one name gradually emerges, not as an answer, but as part of a tragedy that had been smoldering for a long time. Nick Reiner, his son. In the days following the tragedy, while the Brentwood home remained sealed off and the investigation had yet to reach a conclusion, the attention of the American media began to shift, not toward cinematic legacy, but toward a reality that had existed for many years. Born in 1993, Nick is the second son of Rob and Michelle Reiner, and also the one who early on drifted away from the safe orbit of a distinguished Hollywood family and onto a path marked by deep fractures. Nick began struggling with addiction as a teenager around the age of 15. The years that followed were anything but linear rehabilitation, followed by relapse periods of stability, followed by collapse. At times, he no longer had a fixed place to live, drifting across multiple states, falling into homelessness, a life completely at odds with the public image of the Reiner family. Nick did not hide this. In the rare moments when he spoke out, he talked about feeling lost, about being unable to find a place for himself, in a world where the name Reiner was both a privilege and a burden. In 2016, Nick publicly told his story for the first time in an interview with People, not as a defense, but as an admission. He spoke about addiction, about relapses, and about the greatest pain not being his own suffering, but the harm he had caused his parents over many years. Rob Reiner did not stand outside that story. He chose to stand beside his son, not as a director, but as a father who understood that there are battles he cannot fight on his child's behalf. From that experience, Being Charlie Was Born, the semi-autobiographical film Rob Reiner directed, inspired directly by Nick's journey. The film does not try to provide answers, nor does it attempt to neatly resolve the problem. It tells the story of an addicted teenager, of a family's helplessness, and of a love that is not strong enough to save. It is not a healing work, but a confession placed on the screen. For Rob and Michelle, Nick's struggle had no clear climax or definitive ending. It was simply years spent in a state of waiting for their son to improve, waiting for him to stand a little longer than the last time. A form of quiet suffering, prolonged, ongoing, and without an easy name. That past is what placed the name Nick Reiner under particular scrutiny when the tragedy occurred. There have been no formal accusations, no statements from investigators. But the silence from police combined with what was already known was enough for the media to reopen old chapters. What had once been told as a story of rebuilding a life was now reread in a different context more cautiously. As of now, there has been no official statement from police identifying Nick Reiner as a suspect. There is only an open case and a person pulled into the public eye while the truth still lies behind closed doors. Nick has not appeared, has not responded. That silence explains nothing, but it echoes an old reality he has spent much of his life outside the light. From within the family, this may be the greatest tragedy of Rob Reiner's life, not one of career or fame, but that he left this world while his child remained trapped in a life that had yet to find a way out. Throughout his career, Rob Reiner told stories about imperfect families, about people who love one another yet are powerless to save each other. And in the end, his own private life quietly followed that same frame. And to understand why the final chapter of Rob Reiner's life closed with so many silences, one must go much further back to the earliest years when he grew up in the shadow of a father beloved by all of America. Rob Reiner was born into a family where the name itself was already a legacy. In 1947, when he came into the world, Carl Reiner, his father, was not merely a comedian, but one of the minds that shaped post-war American entertainment culture. The Dick Van Dyke Show collaborators like Mel Brooks and an entire era of comedy were built from lines that seemed light on the surface, yet embedded themselves deeply into America's collective memory. Growing up in that household, Rob did not lack love. He did not lack resources. He did not lack opportunity. But he lacked something more essential than all of that, the space to simply be himself. To the outside world, it looked like good fortune. To Rob, it was a shadow that never fully receded. From a very young age, he was introduced not by his own name, but by his relationship, Carl Reiner's son. Every step forward was measured against his father. Every success was examined to determine how much came from talent and how much from inherited legacy. And every failure, no matter how small, was magnified more than it would have been for others, because people always expected the son of a legend to be exceptional by default. The tragedy here was not deprivation, but the constant need to prove worthiness, even when he was already doing very well. Rob Reiner entered acting in the late 1960s, and by 1971, he quickly became a familiar face on American television with the role of Mike "Meathead" Stivic in All in the Family, a series that ran until 1979. The character made him famous, widely loved, and emblematic of a younger generation, progressive, argumentative, and unafraid to challenge old values. At the same time, that role unintentionally boxed him in. In the eyes of 1970s Hollywood, Rob Reiner was still just a sitcom actor, intelligent and sharp, but not someone expected to steer larger stories. When he said toward the end of that decade that he wanted to become a director, many people laughed, not out of malice but out of disbelief. Rob later admitted that this period taught him a bitter truth. Being liked is not the same as being trusted. I realized people liked seeing me on screen, but they didn't believe I could stand behind it. But Rob Reiner did not choose the safe turn. He walked straight into the place where he was not expected and accepted comparison from the very first moment. In 1984, This Is Spinal Tap was released. At first, many assumed it was simply a clever joke, a mockumentary poking fun at the rock scene. But the more people watched, the clearer it became that Rob Reiner was looking directly at an industry accustomed to taking itself very seriously. Without raising his voice, without making declarations, he simply placed the camera in the right spot and allowed the absurdity to reveal itself. In the years that followed, Rob directed films almost without pause. Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, Misery, A Few Good Men. Each film moved in a different direction, yet all shared something difficult to name: the sense that the people within them were not written to be grand, but to feel real. Children were stubborn and fragile. Adults loved, feared, hesitated, and were often unsure whether they were doing the right thing. During that period, Rob Reiner no longer needed to explain who he was. He did not need to argue with those who once doubted him. His films did that work for him. Hollywood gradually stopped calling him Carl Reiner's son, and no longer viewed him as a sitcom actor who had wandered into directing. He was recognized as a director who listened to his characters and trusted small stories. But Hollywood rarely holds space for anyone forever. By the late 1990s, as a new generation emerged, as cinematic rhythms changed and audience tastes began to shift, Rob Reiner's later projects no longer commanded the same attention. There was no dramatic downfall for people to debate, no scandal for the press to chase, no clear collapse that could be easily named. There were simply fewer invitations, phone calls that no longer came first, and the quiet realization that he was no longer the name a meeting room waited to fill before making a decision. Some films were still made, still careful, still bearing his familiar touch. But they passed through theaters more lightly, more quietly. People did not argue much about them. They did not hate them, nor were they eager. It was a very particular kind of Hollywood silence, where things do not end with a door slamming shut, but with the door no longer being held open. For Rob Reiner, being forgotten did not feel like a vacation. It felt like leaving a room you once belonged to while the lights remained on, only no longer shining in your direction. Later, he admitted, nothing collapsed. It just grew quiet. And somehow, I found myself standing outside. Entering the years after 2000, Rob Reiner's life and career did not pivot toward a new, dazzling chapter, but slowed in a deeply human way. He continued making films, but no longer at the center of the conversation. There were no projects that made Hollywood pause to watch. Instead came smaller, quieter films, some arriving and leaving with little echo. Rob did not disappear, but he also did not force his way back to the top at any cost. He appeared more often in measured interviews, speaking about his craft with the voice of someone who had gone far enough to no longer need to prove anything. In that phase, Rob Reiner lived like a storyteller who had stepped back one pace, watching cinema change, watching new generations speak, and accepting his place as part of a past that still existed but no longer demanded the spotlight. It was in that quiet that he became clearer as a human being, no longer chasing the times, not resisting them either. Simply staying with what he believed in, with family, with professional memory, and with the very real understanding that some chapters of a life do not require a climax in order to close. And when he was no longer standing at the center of cinema, Rob Reiner began to appear before the public in a different way. From 2016 onward, when Donald Trump entered the White House and America fell into a prolonged state of division, Rob Reiner became one of the most vocal and consistent opposing voices within the Hollywood artistic community. He did not hide his stance, did not speak in half measures, and did not attempt to soften his message. For some audiences, that bluntness was courage. For others, it became a dividing line. Rob Reiner was gradually no longer seen primarily as a storyteller-director, but as a voice associated with contemporary political debate. In boardrooms, his name did not disappear, but it was no longer as easily embraced as before, not because of professional ability, but because of what he represented in an increasingly polarized society. What is notable is that Rob Reiner did not turn his films into political platforms. He did not rewrite his past to fit the present. Yet his public persona caused his earlier works to be pulled into new conversations where art was no longer received in isolation. Films that once connected audiences purely through emotion now found themselves standing alongside questions they were never created to answer. The tragedy here does not lie in Rob Reiner raising his voice. It lies in the distance that gradually formed between the storyteller and the audience, a distance opened not by conflict, but by caution. And in that quiet space, the films were still there, but the man who made them was no longer listened to in the same way. And then the greatest pain arrived at a moment Rob Reiner could no longer prepare for. In 2020, Carl Reiner passed away at the age of 98. To the world, it was the complete closing of a legend. But to Rob, it was the first time he lost the person who had always stood behind him, the one who shielded him, guided him, and remained there throughout his life, sometimes as a shadow, sometimes as an anchor. After the funeral, Rob once said that he truly felt orphaned even though he was already in his 70s. Not because he lacked care, but because the one person who made him feel that he no longer had to prove anything was gone. When that person left, he was forced to stand alone far later in life than most people ever are. Looking back over his entire life, Rob Reiner's tragedy was not a lack of success. On the contrary, he succeeded so completely that he became part of America's collective memory. Yet he always lived on a fragile boundary between legacy and expectation, between admiration and doubt, between years of acclaim and long stretches of quiet when no one spoke his name. He made films about imperfect families, about people who love one another yet cannot save each other. Not because it was a compelling theme, but because it was something he had lived with all his life. And so everything closes this way. No complete explanation, no neat ending like in a film. What remains is a life fully lived between brilliance and shadows that no one could replace. Rob Reiner leaves behind not only a cinematic legacy, but a deeply human story about family, about love, and about pains that are never fully spoken aloud. If you feel this story is worth pausing for, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to continue accompanying us through the real tragedies behind the lights of Hollywood. Thank you for watching all the way to the end of this video.